actually I've been involved a lot in the organization, in the steering committee, but I've never submitted to TripleA. So this is the first time I present here. So for me, it's a premiere and I'm quite excited. So thank you. And I will be talking about a metalinguistic degree suffix in Tundra Nenets. Some new work that I have done that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So I'm really eager also in seeing your comments today. And this is an outline for my talk. So first, I will briefly talk about the puzzle and then introduce some core things about the Tundra Nenets language, the grammatical properties and general info for you, unless if you've never heard about this language before, especially. And then I'll talk about the data. So first I'll talk about my dissertation and the suffix ka in comparison constructions. And then I will talk about the new data or the new analysis by introducing the ka on nouns and then giving you some theoretical background and giving you the analysis that I have right now for this phenomenon, this fascinating phenomenon. And then I'll conclude. Okay, so in Tundra Nenets, which is an understudied Samoyedic language of the Uralic language family, there is this cool suffix ka that is commonly found in comparison constructions. However, it's also found cross-categorically on nouns, on verbs, on adverbs, and so on. And interestingly, there in other categories than on gradable adjectives in comparisons, informants seem to have trouble finding the correct context, for instance, which points to maybe this coercive power that the suffix might have. So in my dissertation, I proposed that the suffix in comparison constructions is actually a degree modifier that sits on a differential degree argument and says that the difference between two individuals is actually small. Between the two degrees that are mapped to individuals via the gradable relation is small. And in this talk, I propose an analysis of a ka on nouns where it acts as a modifier, kind of a modifier that marks a small difference between degrees of imprecision. So there, we also have a small difference, but to some kind of prototypical standard. And this is the core idea of the whole analysis. This is very much in the spirit of Morzicki's work on metalinguistic comparatives. Okay. So here is some info on Tundra Nenets. I think people enjoy this part of the talk because you don't have to think that much and you see cool maps. So here you can see the Samoyedish, right? The rose bits, which is a huge area in northern Russia, stretching from the west to the east. And I've worked with informants in Naryan-Mar, which is approximately here. I hope you can see this little hand. And I also worked with informants from the Yamal region from the very east. And they have different subdialects, but essentially for the core things that I was interested in, these subdialects didn't play a great role. So here is some info according to Ethnologue. If you're interested, you can read through it. Maybe it's interesting to see that the status is threatened. So we don't have much time to look at this language, essentially. I guess during my lifetime, I still do, but after that, it might be difficult. So some grammatical properties, Tundra Nenets is highly agglutinative, means that it marks grammatical functions on suffixes as suffixes or infixes on words, which makes it quite hard to develop a syntactic story most of the time, right? So that the syntax semantic mapping is tricky oftentimes. Let's talk about nouns because that's interesting for us. The noun is inflected for number, case, absolutive, non-absolutive declension. So there are many, many suffixes to consider. There is no grammatical category for gender, so I can say pudato, which means he, she arrived, making things sometimes easier and sometimes harder. There is a distinction between the genus non-humanum and the genus humanum, so personal and non-personal pronouns. In terms of the number system, there exists the singular, the dual, and the plural, making the glossing of Nenets example even more challenging, because if you have a dual, you have a whole new paradigm, right, to consider for all these declensions. So a lot of time and a lot of fun, right? We have personal suffixes and even tense suffixes sometimes on nouns, which is quite cool, crazy. Here is some info on the verbs. I won't talk about them because it won't be relevant in this talk. Interestingly, to mark, Tundra Nenets is quite consistently head final, so this is a verb last language quite rigidly. We also have postposition, and an example is in 1, ngangerts niña, and this ngangerts guy will occupy us later on when we talk about ka on nouns. Now, this is the word order proposed in Salmina and Nikolaeva, so basically it's SOV, okay? Which won't really concern us too much too. So let's go to the data that will be relevant today. What is the distribution of a ka in comparative constructions and beyond? That's the question. And first I'll talk about the suffix ka in comparative constructions. That's where I feel very comfortable in, but also it will be important to understand the parallel between the two analyses. So in my dissertation, I show that ka in comparatives is not the comparative marker, like it has been claimed in descriptive grammars. And there is no word morphological marking of the comparative. It's not the differential argument either. And it's also not an argument that quantifies off the differential. And I'll show you the data that shows that. This suffix is importantly also blocked when the difference between the associate and the standard is big. So the example is in 5b, Katja Masha had ngarkavna pirčarka is bad. So when I make explicitly clear that the difference between Katja and Masha is big, the suffix is out. And the comment of one of my informants, but there were many similar comments like that, if there is a big difference in heights, you cannot use ka. Okay, so, so this difference has to be a small one, peculiar, right? Okay. And now the example in 4, for instance, shows that Tundra Nenets has degree ontology, so it is a degree for language. And I'm just using diagnostics from Beck et al. 2009. Differential comparatives, as in 4, I can say polka 72 centimeter have jambarka. So the shelf is a little longer than 80 centimeters. There is a reference to a degree. And also, crucially, there are differential comparatives that I will talk about a little bit later. Here are some more examples that show that neither the polarity of the adjective makes a difference, nor does it matter whether the individuals compared are tall or small in the context. So if you look at 6, what you see there is that if you have 2 individuals that are small, but the difference between is established to be big in the context, so let's say 25 centimeters is a big difference, and I tell that to my informants, you know, we agree on that, then the sentence in 6a is fine without the marking with ka, but 6b is out. Okay, so I cannot say Katja Tanya had pirčarka. Now, if the 2 individuals are very small, but the difference between them is also small, then I can say both. I can say Tanya Katja had nudja or Tanya Katja had nudjarka, right? So again, here the difference between the individuals is small. If both individuals are tall, but again, the difference is small, I also can use both the unmarked form and the form with ka, okay? So from that, you already can see that ka is felicitous if you have a standard and an associate, as long as the difference between the 2 individuals is small, okay? Now, the example in 9 is a differential comparative, which rules out the possibility of a ka being the differential argument itself or something that quantifies it off, because this place is already saturated by 5 centimeters, right? So the differential 5 centimeters is there, and it cannot be the ka itself. And this is interesting compositionally because how do you do that then, right? Everything is saturated. And what I came up with then in my thesis is something called degree restriction that I call like this because it's in the spirit of things we know from restrict by Chung and Ladusso in the nominal domain for object incorporation and things like that, but also event identification by Kratzer that I didn't put here on the handout. So the analysis of the differential comparatives in 9 is shown in 10 through 13. You see the lexical entries, and here this abstract or ka, it's the abstract operator because it's not, it's not there where it originates in, is just lambda dd is small. So it's just kind of a property of degrees. And then you can compose all that. And what you get is here in E, the maximal degree of height that Katya reaches exceeds Masha's height by 5 centimeters, and 5 centimeters is a small value in C. So you get this additional information via the restriction operation that the difference between the individuals is small. Okay. All right, so now let's go to the meat of today's talk, and that's the suffix ka on nouns. Strikingly, we can see ka also on nouns, as well as cross-categorically. You can look at the data in the appendix if you're interested. And the examples can be found in the literature already. So it's not something, I came up with my informants, but you can find examples of this in, for example, Tereshenko in 1947, where Puhutsa in 14 is an old woman, and she translates Puhutsarka as less of an old woman, whatever that means. And so I asked my informants, what does Puhutsarka mean? And they said, it's not a young woman, but also not an old woman yet. So some middle-aged woman, okay? Okay, so I found that very interesting. And then I started to explore different kinds of nouns in a way, right? So if you look at 15a, ngam gets, that's a chair example. If I just say ngam gets tsarka, it's even hard to pronounce, it's kind of a chair. And so, as I said, informants have sometimes trouble coming up with a scenario to explain what that actually means. But for this example, I have a very good scenario that not me, but my informant came up with. So she said, imagine my father wants to build a chair, but actually he's not a good craftsman. It was a fact, actually. So he did it, but the final product does not exactly meet the criteria for being a good chair or a proper chair. So either there is something missing, a leg, or the chair is tilted, or the chair does not look like a prototypical chair, right? So this would be a suitable example, a suitable context for saying namrud sarka. Now I thought, okay, what about animate nouns, right? Animate subjects like neba, mother. What would it mean to say nebarka? And, mother is very loaded with different prototypical things a mother should be, nurturing, caring, blah, blah, blah. And so what would that mean to say motherka, nebarka? And then that would mean something like a mother who kind of fulfills her duties as a mother, but not quite. So something is missing to really call her, she's a mother, she's a great mother, something like this. Near woman, also nierka, kind of a woman, but does not behave like one in all relevant respects. So again, this is very culturally loaded what this would mean. And I think it would shift from culture to culture, what that exactly means. Then if you take something rather derogative like taleh, thief, what would talehka mean? Someone who has started being a thief. So maybe people saw him taking something away once in the village, but he's not a full-fledged thief. Something is missing to call him a thief. What if you take snow, sira? Sirarka, a light snow, so kind of not a full-fledged snow, but snow, a little bit of snow. A wolf. So with these, with animals, people had much trouble because I think, you have clear imagination of what a wolf is. Wolf has 4 legs, you know, he's gray, whatever. And then people really struggle to explain what that means. But if I say Saramirka, that would be something like, it's hard to tell whether it is a wolf or not. It's a kind of a wolf or maybe not. So maybe I'm mistaken because I cannot identify when I see this at a distance. Okay, so what is common to all these nominal examples? I think what unites them is that when we add the rka, there's always this weakening or attenuation going on, right? This weakening effect. So for an inanimate object like chair in 15a, we get kind of a chair, but not a prototypically ideal chair. With animate subjects like mother, which are often associated with certain typical properties, we get a subtraction of these properties, right? Something is missing to call this person a mother, right? So this is reminiscent of what Deci calls incompleteness of quantity, but he only talks about adjectives, okay? And so he doesn't talk about nouns. So the closest translation of rka nouns in English would be probably something like sorta, kinda, and so on. And we know this is a hedge. This is something that marks vagueness in English, right? So descriptively speaking, this suffix coerces something non-gradable into something gradable, probably, right? And then tells us that the property considered is not the full-fledged property of being a chair, for instance. And it always diminishes the quality or the amount of, with verbs, sometimes the time span by a certain degree, right? Let's call it degree. Now, how exactly can we implement this data pattern in a formal semantic framework, also maintaining this parallel to the analysis that I have in comparisons? And I will argue for a degree-based analysis because of several reasons that I haven't laid out yet, but I want to briefly mention them. So why do I want this degree-based thing? Synchronically speaking, as we've seen, rka is most common in comparisons, right? So it kind of comes from there, it feels. And this is also shown in my data that you haven't seen in contextual comparatives. So something like Peter is taller. In these comparatives, when I put the unmarked form, people not always accept the comparative interpretation. But as soon as I put rka, everyone gets the comparative interpretation. And this a little thing gets lost there. Okay, so marking a little difference. And this might be pointing to a change in progress that we're starting to witness, where ka is turning in a real comparative morpheme or maybe even operator. And I want to capture this connection and the intuition from comparatives where ka marks a small difference, but this time not between regular degrees, but rather degrees of imprecision, okay? So here is the theoretical background. What's the timing? I'm okay. The intuition that I want to be model is that we want to coerce something traditionally non-gradable into something gradable. But we want to maintain this core meaning that we mark a small difference somehow. Compositionally, this will look different. And this is also due to the fact that degrees of imprecision are really ontologically different from the normal degrees that are points on a degree scale that are totally ordered. So I think this is because of this conceptual difference that we will see differences in the composition. And as a basic line of research, I take the Morzicki stuff on the metalinguistic comparatives, and he was, followed by Anderson and Bochnek and Šipak, who analyzed ish, and Anderson, who analyzed sorta and kinda, these hedges. So let's look briefly at Morzicki. Okay. So he analyzes these metalinguistic comparatives such as John is more dumb than crazy by introducing degrees of imprecision. And these degrees, they measure the halo size of an expression. Halos, as Laserson has coined them. So according to Laserson, the pragmatic halo of an expression is a set of semantic objects of the same type as its denotation. So they have the same semantic type, let's say ET, which differ in only pragmatically ignorable ways. So everything has a halo, right? Every noun has a halo, and you can also do it with other categories. The key idea here is that metalinguistic comparatives compare imprecision, and these degrees of imprecision provide a means of measuring the halo size. And interestingly, he models the halos as sets of alternatives. So there, then compositionally, all of the alternative compositional mechanisms apply, for instance, pointwise function application and these things, okay? And so a sentence like John is more dumb than crazy will then be something like, it's more appropriate to say that John is dumb than it is to say that John is crazy. So it's more precise to say that John is dumb than it is to say that John is crazy. So we are kind of comparing the degrees of precision. Anderson uses this to analyze the hedge sorter that can modify verbs and nouns. And he doesn't really show how this would work with nouns, but he does show how this would work with verbs. So an example, like he sort of swam over to the boat. And I use also, you know, a lot of his ideas in my analysis. And Anderson determines two different sources of gradability, the first one being inherent gradability of scalar adjectives, and the other one being coerced gradability derived from sets of alternatives. And here I would say that Roca on nouns would kind of force this coerced gradability. That's what would force you to change the meaning of the noun, the normal meaning. Bachniak and Šipak look at ish and use ideas from Mozicki too. So an example like the cake has a coffee-ish flavor. While Anderson's sorter requires a degree to be close to the standard of this comparison, ish requires a degree to be lower than the standard. And I think that the ka in that respect is more like ish, right? So something is always missing to be a good mother or a proper wolf or whatever. So let's look at the analysis. I propose that this non-recount nouns is a degree modifier and a halo widener, basically. So it has these coercive powers when used with predicates without a gradable interpretation. So if there is non-gradable predicate, it forces a type shift. How does it do it? It does it by a type shift operator called prec, just as Mozicki does it and Anderson does it, so that it can saturate the degree of precision argument. And this is this operation that you see in 18. Also, to determine whether two objects are similar, we need a standard of similarity and a context, so it's standard D, and a context C that provides the scale of similarity. And you can see this cross-categorical approximates relation in 19 that basically explains what this approximate relation is, okay? And then you can say that the standard of similarity can be construed as a degree D, a real number in the interval between 0 and 1. So let's imagine we want to say something is a chair-ish or ka, and then depending on how many things lack for it to be a proper chair, you would have, you know, the degree being 0.8. That's very close to a chair, or 0.5. Half the way, or you know, if it's at 1, it's a proper chair. So this is how Mozicki models this. So what would that mean? In 20, I show you this chair that basically is a set of alternatives, okay, as we will see later. So F resembles chair to at least degree D. That's what it says. It opens up these alternatives. to the chair. Now, when we apply the shifting operator to chair, it makes this chair gradable. So we get this property and then the alternatives in that property. With the help of this preg operator, the suffix ka can now apply to the new noun that is gradable and return a property that holds of an individual to a degree that's close to, but is a little less than the standard degree of precision. And for that, I'm using this predicate small, just to say the difference between the prototypical standard and what Rkadid uses from it is small, okay? So the Aleph that serves as an input is in 15a. We have Rka, we have nominal, we have the preg operator, and we have chair. And the standard also is needed, is a function that is defined for standards associated with a degree of precision. This is this thing at 1, right? This is the standard degree. So remember that halos are modeled as sets of alternatives. And what our suffix then does, it picks a single alternative from this halo of chair and applies it to the individual argument of ka. So it does actually a lot of stuff. So if you look at the composition in 24, what we get informally under 24c, we have a property such that there is a degree which is slightly below the standard degree of precision for chairs, and pick one alternative to chairs that is similar or close, but not a chair. So for example, a chair missing a leg, and these are these alternatives, right? Chair without a leg, tilted chair, whatever. So in other words, the difference between a prototypical chair and chair ka is small. Okay. So what happens here is a lot. Ka does several things. It existentially quantifies over degrees that are close at a small distance to the standard degree of precision. It widens the pragmatic halo by this. And since it needs a gradable property, it's responsible for this preg type shift, for this type shift to something gradable. It quantifies over the degree of precision of the non-gradable property. And finally, a function is picked from the halo and applied to the individual argument, right? Thereby picking only one alternative from this set, because we need to agree on, you know, what this person means by chair ka. It cannot be all the alternatives. Okay, so I'm already concluding. I proposed here an analysis of a ka on nouns that allows us to maintain this link to the suffix ka encountered in comparatives. And the connection is that in both cases, the suffix marks some small difference, one time between normal degrees and the other time between these degrees of imprecision. I think that's a nice part of the analysis. And if there are other problems, then I'm willing to hear about them. So, and I think it's nice that this nominal ka provides us with an example of a more thing that can force this gradability. I mean, we need some kind of gradability to be able to understand the meaning. And it requires some kind of coercion, apparently, right? And how we model this can be debated. The suffix outside of comparisons is a great candidate to be added to this whole pleiad of the expressions that we know, like sorta, ish. And so far, the picture has been rather Anglocentric, so I think ka can add to this more full cross-linguistic picture of these vagueness markers or hedges. And I think this is the first step towards doing this for Tundra Nenets. Of course, there are many directions for future work I'm thinking about. So how to analyze a ka on verbs, which is a whole new story, right? We need to consider all kinds of things like events and running time and whatnot. And then look at competing theories, for instance, Sassoon's work, who rather focuses on psychological work and talks about how you can make a noun gradable and how it can have different dimensions. So I would like to look at that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Polina.
Shall I stop sharing or shall I keep on my hand?
Why don't you leave it open for now in case people have data questions or questions about some of the lambdas?
Sure.
Andrew has a question in the chat, but I also see a number of raised hands. I give the first one to Margit.
I actually think Natasha was first. Natasha and Malta were before me, I think.
Well, I made an executive decision
Okay,
here.
all right. Okay, well, so I just have a very quick comment, which is, so, well, first, I love this talk. It was super, super interesting. So my comment is that this is interesting to me in particular because there's a similar suffix that I've found in Walpole, and it only goes on nouns. So fortunately, it avoids the problem with verbs. But it seems to have a very similar meaning, particularly when it goes with like canonical nouns like, you know, dog or teacher. So I don't have like as nice of explained contexts as you do, but it does have this like attenuation, like imprecise sort of meaning. And the real connection to this work, I think, is speakers will put it on the property concept words, which are nouns in Walpole, in crisp judgment contexts, sometimes where you have this small degree of difference between them. So yeah, it's sort of interesting to see like a similar strategy being used in a degreeless language. So I thought it was really interesting.
Wow. Yeah, great to know. All right.
Natasha.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I actually have a suggestion for future work and maybe an alternative analysis. It smells of subjectivity. So you analyze it as imprecision, but it is also very similar to the idea that, well, maybe this is not a canonical chair. I think it is a chair. And then you could use some other word by Laserson, judge dependence. So and in general, I think it is relevant for gradability and whether we have gradability in semantics. Is it coercion or not? So you're saying that with nouns, we really make them gradable, and then we have the halo and the scale of what is more of a chair, less of a chair. Another way of looking at it would be to say that there is some kind of subjective assessment in a given context. And it is also relevant to what is considered small. So for normal humans, 5 centimeters is a small difference. But what if we're talking about, I don't know, we're talking about giants, and then a small difference will be something else. Is it really context dependent or is it assessor dependent? And as a parallel, Andrea Beltrame has a paper in English totally. It's kind of the opposite of the attenuation effect you have here. End of ish. So they totally started as an intensifier, a degree modifier. And then you could use, say, well, this is totally a chair, totally awesome, and so on. And then the idea is that it's something really starting as a degree modifier and moving in a completely subjective territory. And I'm wondering if something like that can be going on in Nenets, maybe not. So I really don't know. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Like really, really cool stuff.
So could you say the last question, whether in Nenets what is possible?
So do you think it could explain Nenets? Do you think some subjectivity is at play here, or is it really context-dependent phenomenon and we're widening the halo?
So I would say the latter. I think, you know, as I said, context dependent. For me, this is already the part where things can vary depending on which culture you're in. But I think that all of the informants that I asked about these things agree that this is something you could say, for example, I don't know, niaka, or kind of a woman, but it's very hard to explain what it means. For instance, in Russian, right? We always talk Russian because there is no such attenuation on a noun, but I didn't feel like there was, you know, there was a dispute whether it has this attenuating effect or not. Some subjectivity might be, of course, I think comes in there because, you know, what is a kind of a chair? For one person, it's that, for the other, it's that. However, at this point, I wouldn't know absolutely how to put it into a compositional story that I wanted to make. But that's definitely something I haven't thought about, subjectivity, and I don't know the literature. So thank you for the hints.
Come to Esley.
Andrew.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thanks for that. I was wondering if you know whether the suffix can appear in nominal comparatives of a metalinguistic flavor, whether you've investigated that. So these comparatives like Kim is more linguist than philosopher, for example. You know, and perhaps it would require a context where you know, Kim is more linguist than philosopher, but maybe not by much. But yeah, I wondered if you had investigated those.
Not at all. So I haven't looked at these. So I think these are really these metalinguistic ones from Mozeki, right? No, I haven't, to be honest. I have no idea how that will work. Even in Russian already, I'm starting to think. I think it's not trivial to say something like this in Russian already. Yeah.
So I suppose what I was wondering, I mean, supposing you can, then I guess that raises the question whether the adjectival ones are actually should be treated as logical comparison, like your original analysis does, or whether those might even be metalinguistic as well.
Yeah, the thing is, so whenever you put the rka on an adjective, especially the gradable ones, you never get this reading. For example, she's childish or something. You don't get things like, you know, something is hot-ish, but not hot. You always, you always get back to some kind of comparison construction. So somehow in the adjectival domain, it seems that it does not have this effect as it does outside of the adjectives.
Okay, thanks.
We have 2 minutes left and three. I had a question from Anna as well, which I don't see. So I'm going at the moment. So I'll hand over to Malte for now and have some time during the break for more questions.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's a short question, I believe. It's also a data question and it touches upon what Natasha asked about this context sensitivity of the thing in the adjectival comparative use. So the way you specify this in 13, you just say this degree is small given some context, right? So presumably, and then without further context, normally I guess on the tallness scale, 5 centimeter is small and 20 would not be. But say, I guess what you would predict is that in the context where before you talk about taller, larger thingies with a larger difference, you should also be able to say something like she's 20 centimeters taller, and that's little given the context, right? Say before that you compare the size of a brontosaurus with a tyrannosaurus or something, and then you talk about humans. I mean, I know it would be fun to check these and probably impossible. Did you ever go so far to check for such data?
So no, very limited. And what I always try to agree on before the informant gave me the judgment is to say, okay, do we agree that in this context, this is a small difference? Do we agree that this is a medium difference? Do we agree that this is a big difference? That's how I try to, you know, tackle this. But it would be fun to look at more marked examples like you mentioned, definitely.
I mean, perhaps I can find one or two sensible, like context, like cultural appropriate examples or something, right? Where you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Tyrannosaurus Rex, whether this would work. But we could do something with, I don't know, giant, giant
reindeers.
Yeah.
The weight of a whale and a walrus or something, and then you compare the weight.
Yeah, that would work. That would be fun. Yeah, that would be good to explore.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great talk.
All right, let's take a coffee break at this stage, or depending on your time zone, a tea break. But before we do, let's thank Polina again for her talk. Thank you, Polina.
Thank you.
So we have a 20-minute coffee break, and at 4